Greetings, I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to build this S model T-35. This is a plastic model in 1/72nd scale, and I've had it sitting on my desk for a little while now. You may remember me mentioning it in my S model Crusader video. The T-35 is one of those entertainingly silly Russian tank designs that are just so fun and derpy. Not as derpy as a KV-2 mind you, but still. I've been excited to build this since I got it. The box is about what we would expect from an S model kit. Nice, simple, and consistent with their other boxes. I like it. The back is, of course, upside down. It has some basic painting suggestions and some warnings. Pretty simple stuff. Let's look inside the box. Because this is a giant tank, it has some much larger parts than other S model kits do, and so the sprues are also much bigger. This kit makes 2 tanks, and each tank is made up of 2 of these very big sprues, and 1 of these much smaller sprues with shovels, axes, and saws. Like the previous S model kits I've built, the parts on these sprues look quite neat and tidy. Everything is moulded crisply and I couldn't find any defects, though the 2 bigger sprues do have a minor bend in them. That doesn't seem to affect any of the actual parts though. There are mould lines, there's always mould lines, but fortunately they're not too bad on this kit, and in a lot of places you might not even be able to see them without looking very closely, so they're easy to clean up and shouldn't cause any issues. The detailing on these parts is pretty decent. I wouldn't say they're super detailed, but they are reasonable. There are a few quite fine parts, like the radio antenna for example, and you'll have to be careful with those because they're very easy to break. Unlike some of the other S model kits I've built, there's a fairly high number of parts here. That's not a bad thing at all, of course, it just means that the build time will be slightly longer. Of course, this kit has some photo-etch parts. At this point I would be surprised if it didn't. They're pretty simple in this kit, just some, I think, towing hooks. Looks like there's a couple of spares here too, which is nice. It's pretty easy to lose these tiny bits of photo-etch. There's also a set of decals. These are just some simple red stars. I don't suppose you really need much else. If you want to add some slogans or other kinds of markings, you'll have to find them elsewhere. You probably won't be surprised to see that instructions are included. This is a pretty simple 4-page dealie. The first page has pretty much the same info as the box. The instruction diagrams themselves are a little small in places, but they're easy enough to understand and follow. Let's start this build with the tracks. As you can see here, the bulk of the tracks come as one part. I like this. It kind of helps to keep everything nice and neat. That said, there are still quite a few parts to attach. I start with the inner part of the drive sprocket. This isn't really keyed, but the section with no teeth should sit against the top bit of the track here like so. It's not too bad, but not quite perfect, so I quickly added the curved end piece of track before the glue holding the drive sprocket bonds. It goes on pretty easily, though unfortunately there's a bit of a gap in the tracks which doesn't look super great. It's not that bad, but it's not great. You could probably hide that with mud or something, or maybe even some of the parts of the tank will help hide, or at least distract from this gap. Moving on, I add the idler wheel. This has no keying and it doesn't really need any, but do make sure the spokes on the wheels line up with each other. This is obviously pretty easy. I then added the inner half of the road wheels in their bogies. This goes in easily. I added the glue after putting them in place because why not? I quite like that this set of bogies is a single piece. It makes installation a little quicker and easier, but what I don't like is that there's a bar joining each of them at the wheels. I don't think it's realistic, and I'm pretty sure it would be visible under the side skirting when that's installed, so I clipped them off. Easy enough. Obviously it's a good idea to do this after installing the parts on the track assembly. Much better. I think these are some interesting looking bogies and suspension parts. It's almost a shame that most of it will be hidden. Because I'm a bit of a dunderhead, I forgot to film myself adding the front curved section of track, but rest assured it went into place easily enough. Next comes the short flat part that goes between the idler and the first road wheel, with the little roller in between. You'll notice there's a couple of guide horns missing to allow for that little roller to fit into place against the track, and into place it goes easily, as does the one at the rear going down from the drive sprocket. Both of these parts are flat, except for one slightly angled link of track. That link is the end that joins under the road wheels, just so you know which way around those parts should go. The result is pretty good. A bit more work than the usual S-model tracks are, but not too bad at all. They certainly have some nice detail where they need it. Not all the way around, but certainly where you'll see it. The other track set goes together in pretty much exactly the same way, and they can then be installed onto the lower hull part. I did encounter a problem here. The idler wheel won't go all the way onto its axle, so it sticks out too far from the hull. This is obviously annoying. It was easy enough to fix though. I just trimmed the axle down a bit. It's a simple solution, but it did work, and that's what matters. Of course, do make sure you've got things around the right way. The front of the hull has a bit of an angular cutout to it, for lack of better words, and the rear is more gently angled. The drive sprockets should be at the rear of the tank. I added a bit of glue to the points where the bogies touch the hull for a little bit of extra strength, and then the instructions suggest that it's time to work on the upper hull. First, I add these comically short tow cables. They're probably not actually that short, given the length of this tank. They were a bit annoying to clean up after clipping from the sprue though. There were a lot of attachment points on this part, but I did eventually get it cleaned up enough. It goes here, guided by some pins. I apply the glue from the underside to try and make it a bit neater. I guess that's the positive side of doing this before gluing the halves of the hull together. Next comes a little bit of spare track link. There's nothing to guide this, so you've just got to eyeball its positioning. It should go more or less where I've put it. I wonder if maybe it wasn't fastened to the hull on the real thing. I kind of doubt the tank could have moved rapidly enough to throw the spare tracks off anyway. Then I install this exhausty bit. I'm assuming this is a combination muffler and exhaust pipe. It goes into place quite easily with the aid of guide pins, though I suppose it could be put on backwards. The opening of the pipe should be facing towards the rear. Then comes this little piece of cowling that goes around the front and sides of the exhaust. There are guide pins on the sides of this, though I found applying pressure was needed to avoid a gap along the front edge. After that's in place, I attach this radiator grille. Or at least that's what I assume it is. This goes into place quite easily, though it doesn't look like it really matches up with that bit of cowling. I guess it probably isn't meant to. If you wanted to, you could pre-paint the area under this black to make sure you got everything and give it some depth. But the grills on the vent part are big enough that I don't foresee any problem getting paint in there without clogging up details, so I'm just going to leave it. Next, I add this saw. It wouldn't really be a Russian tank without a saw to allow the crew to fetch themselves the traditional Soviet tank log. There are guide pins, so the part is quite easy to install. I add glue from the inside and then I move on to install these. I don't know what they are. I'm assuming some kind of cover for air intakes. That seems plausible to me. They go into place easily enough. There are guide tabs that ensure that. The angled part should face outwards towards the sides of the tank. They look very venty, I guess. They might not be vents at all. I follow those with these boxes with brackety things on them. There is one of these for either side of the main turret towery thing. There's nothing too tricky about getting these into place. There's some keying so they line up good and proper, though I did find I needed to apply some pressure to take care of some pesky gaps. In between those angled brackets we can attach this thing. Be careful when removing whatever it is from the sprue and cleaning it up. The little bar thing coming out of the side is quite thin and delicate. I just looked at it and it bent, but at least it didn't break. It's pretty simple to put into place. The wider end should be facing upwards, and as you can see, I've done that here. Then this little grid thing goes on top like so. There's a very fine guide pin on this to help get it into the right spot. It's pretty easy, and the one for the right side is pretty much exactly the same as the one I've just installed. Next comes what looks like a roll of cable. I found I needed tweezers to get this into place because of how it's positioned in that little corner. Not too tricky to do that though. Whatever it is, it's an interesting little detail. Then I add the horn. If you look really closely, you may be able to see the teeny tiny guide pin on this part. This goes into place here at the front of the hull. A little nudging and it's in place. Now the tank can make honking sounds to let people know that it's there. Otherwise, how are they going to know there's a monstrous tank lumbering by? Then, while we're at the front of the tank, we might as well add the headlamps. These are easy enough to attach, though they did need a little nudging, but that's not really a problem. I think most of us can manage that. Now the tank has two nice shiny lamps for shining. The time has now come to join the upper and lower halves of the hull together. This does seem like an easy enough task, and it was. There are two obvious guide pins and sockets to line things up. I apply pressure to make sure everything is as gap-free as I can make it, and then we're left with this hull, which, to be honest, doesn't quite look right without the side skirts. So I suppose they should be added next, and luckily the instructions agree. The mounting bars, or whatever you would call them, along the top of these panels are a little bit fragile, so do be careful when you're clipping them from the sprues and cleaning them up. It's pretty easy to see where the mounts should go on the hull. There are strips of rivets that you should align these with. I glued them on one at a time to try and avoid making a mess. I can imagine it being quite easy to make a bit of a gluey mess if the part were to slip out of alignment while you're trying to glue all of the tabs into place at once. Fortunately, I managed to get this into place with no glue disasters. Once both of those are in place, the hull is now pretty much complete. Now we need to assemble 100 turrets. Well, 5. That's like 100. Why not start with the main turret? I glue the two halves of the turret body together like so. There are pins to guide it and the fit is quite nice. You can barely see the join at the rear, and the one on the front, while also almost invisible, will be covered. Then I slide the machine gun through the back of its mounting. This is pretty easy. I glue it in place and then I thought, why not install this into the turret? The fit of this part is, well, awful, to be perfectly honest. To get the gun facing forward, I have to leave this huge gap in the side. I think this is the first time I've been disappointed by S-Model. I mean, it's not the worst thing in the world and it can be fixed with a bit of putty, it's just a bit disappointing. Moving on, it's time to assemble the main gun. I glue this little whatever you call it onto the mantlet part. There's a square mounting hole and corresponding pin to make sure this goes on nice and straight, though I guess a square pin means that you could still put it on wrong in 3 ways. Just don't, okay? Or you'll be sent to the gulag. I'm pretty sure you don't want that. The gun assembly then mounts into what I hope is the obvious place for it. It's pretty easy to get this stubby little thing into the right spot. There is a little bit of a gap where it meets the mantlet, but that can easily be filled in. That assembly can then be glued onto the front of the turret body. There's a rectangular keying bit that makes sure this gun sits nicely in place. I apply some pressure to make sure that it's on good and proper. Looks good. Well, not so much when viewed from this side, but the gun itself isn't too bad. I then install the roof. This goes into place pretty easily, just needs a bit of pressure to minimize the gaps and make sure it's on good and tight. The fit doesn't look perfect, but I suppose that's probably quite normal of Soviet construction. I do quite like the star embossed on the roof. That's pretty cool. It would make sense to put the hatch on next. This is just as easy as it looks. I have to wonder though if those 2 holes in the hatch are for mounting a handle or something. I didn't see a handle in the instructions, so maybe that's not the case. Oh well, it still looks good and hatchy anyway. Next comes the antenna. This is really thin and fiddly, and there were a lot of sprue gates that needed to be removed from it. I would suggest you do this as carefully as you can. Once you've cleaned it up, it's not that hard to install. There are mounting pins for it in the appropriate places all around the turret. Like the hull side panels, I glue these on 1 or 2 at a time to make things a bit easier and less messy. That turret is now done. Very nice. Let's just put it here while we build the rest of them. The 2 halves of this second biggest turret go together just about as well as the main turret. That is to say, very nicely. The join on the rear is slightly more visible, but the way these go onto the tank you'll be really unlikely to see it. Then I glue the mantlet onto the turret body. The raised rectangular bit guides the positioning, and the fit is pretty nice. Next I add the machine gun. The fit here is a bit tight. I used my knife to force the gun into place. This does of course come with the risk of the gun flying off into space, but I wasn't really applying that much pressure. Maybe this should have been inserted through the back of the mantlet, but oh well, it's done now. I then install the main gun, well, the main gun for this turret. This goes into the mounting hole for it quite easily. There's a tiny bit of play in this, so do make sure that it's lined up nice and straight. You don't want a wonky gun now, do you? The turret needs a roof, so we might as well install that now. This is pretty easy. There isn't really any keying here though, so you'll have to pay a bit of attention and make sure you're putting it on the right way. The 2 hatches should be on the rearward side of this turret. Obviously we need to make 2 of these, but you've seen me build it once, and you don't need to see me do it again, and if you do, you can just skip backwards a minute or two. In fact, you can watch it as many times as you like. I'm going to go on and build the smallest turrets. Like the other turrets, the 2 halves of this turret body go together easily, and the fit is pretty decent. There is a bit of a gap on the back, but again, the way these are mounted on the tank, you probably won't see it. I then slide the machine gun through the turret's front plate, which is pretty easy. Do pay attention to the instructions to determine if you're putting this in the right way up. I then install that plate and gun into the turret body. Because the gun mount is ever so slightly off-center, the gun should be in the upper left corner from the gunner's perspective. The front plate here does look a little bit messy as I've glued it in, but it can be cleaned up a little bit with a sanding stick. I did that off camera though. Then I added the roof. This was easy enough, though a little bit gappy, even though I applied plenty of pressure. It's not quite as good as the other turrets, but it's still okay. Maybe it's an example of Soviet construction techniques. It might be a less important turret, so they've put less effort into building it. Like the previous turret, we need to make 2 of these, and then that's it for the turrets. But we're not done quite yet. Turns out those shovels on the small sprues need to go on. These are really fragile. You can see that I've broken 3 of the 4 while trying to clean them up. That's a bit annoying, but I do have 1 left, so I glued it into place here. There's nothing to guide this, so you just have to sort of eyeball it. It does look very shovelly. If I had another one of these, it would go right next to the first one, but facing the other way. Simple enough. I guess we can make a story to explain this and say that the crew have lost one of their shovels in glorious combat, and the crew of the other tank this box can build have lost both of theirs. Either way, both crews go to Gulag. Then comes this axe. This has guide pins on the bottom, but there are no corresponding mounting holes, so I just shaved the pins off. I glued it here, which looks about right to me, and that's the tools done. Now it's time for the photo-etch parts, which I almost forgot. These are what I think are lifting or towing points, and they're pretty easy to install here underneath the radiator grille part. To be fair, you could probably get away with not installing these. It probably wouldn't be noticed, but it is nice to have them there. You can see that I've not quite got them level with each other. Oh well, good strong Soviet construction? No? Moving on, I install all of the turrets. Unlike a lot of models similar to this, including other S-model kits, these don't have any kind of locking tabs or anything to hold them into place. This will probably be annoying if you're planning to handle this model. I probably won't be, so I suppose it's fine. It is a bit unusual though. Just a minor complaint really. What matters is the S-model T-35 is now complete. It's a pretty cool model of a really interesting tank. Normally I would be full of praise for S-model. See my videos about their other kits for that. I do have to say though that this isn't the best of their models I've done. I do like it of course, it's nowhere near the worst model I've ever built, just that there's a couple of bad gaps like the machine gun on the side of the main turret, and the turrets just fall off when you pick up the model. In fairness, those aren't the worst things, not by a long shot. I guess maybe I've just developed some rather high expectations from S-model, reasonably so in my opinion. And when you have high expectations, not everything is going to be able to live up to them. Still, I do like the model, and once the gaps have been filled and it's been painted, I think it's going to make a really nice model of a rather silly and entertaining tank. The build was pretty easy, though there were a few fiddly bits and some fine parts that could very easily be damaged when removing them from the sprue, so a fair bit of care has to be taken with those. That does make it take a little bit longer to build the model, but I think it's worth it. Better to go slow and get it done right with no breakages than to spend extra time fixing things because you were careless, or in a rush. I guess the longer it takes to build the model, the better value for money you're getting, if you want to look at it that way. I think the result is pretty good. This tank is ridiculously large. You can't really tell here on this white background, but it's at least as long as 2 Panzer IIIs end to end. I imagine it was quite hard to steer. Silly, but cool. I'm no T-35 surgeon, so I can't really tell you if this kit is especially accurate or not. It's obviously not super detailed or anything, but I do believe these kits are intended as gaming kits. At any rate, it's perfectly fine for my purposes anyway. I like it. What do you guys think? Have you built this kit? Or some other T-35? Do you think it's a ridiculous tank? Let me know in the comments below, and feel free to ask any questions you might have. Also, don't forget to subscribe, follow, dingle the bell, and all the other things you do on YouTube and social media. And if you really like the things I do, please consider supporting over on Patreon, or by purchasing a shirt or mug from my merch store. Links to all the things are in the description below. And as always, I shall return soon. So until then, be excellent to each other, and thanks for watching. Farewell.